Masechet Ketubot Daf Chavtet. We begin a brand new topic which has to do with kanas, fines that are due to a na'ara, a young woman who is raped or seduced. Elu na'arot sheyesh lehem kanas, the following deserve to be paid this kanas should they be victim to such a crime. All right, we're going to be referring a lot to these two sets of pisukim. One in Devarim is talking about the victim of rape. Reads Kimsa ish na'ara betula. So you see, it specifies that it's talking about a na'ara, which the Talmud is going to explain. It's talking about a young girl who is both 12 and has two hairs as sign of her growth. And she is a betula. It was because she's a betula, when she gets married, she would deserve 200 zuz. And now this rapist is, in addition to, he'd have to pay a lot of things. He'll have to pay for her pain and suffering and shame and all that. In addition, he's going to have to pay because now she's no longer a betula. So if asher lo orasa utfasa v'shachab ima, she was not yet engaged to anyone, and he grabs her and has relations with her forcibly, v'nimsao, and then he is discovered. They are discovered. V'natan isha shocheb ima la'abi na'ara hamishim kasef. He has to give to the father of this young girl 50 kesef. This is important because now we define exactly what that number is. And furthermore, v'lo tiyeh le'isha tachat asher aina, and he must marry her if she wants. Lo yuchal shalacha koyamav, and he cannot divorce her unless she wants to divorce him. Now, why would she want to marry him? Who knows? But the point is that he is now obligated to feed, clothe, and give her shelter for his whole life. So that's even more than the 50 shekel. Okay, it could be, people that know each other or whatever, and he's going to have in mind, listen, if I violate her and know she's no longer a betula, I'm going to have to marry her. So you could think of it as a kind of a date rape type of case. And if she is okay, and he does this, he should have married her first. If he doesn't, then he is obligated to marry her if she's agreeable. If not, then he just pays this fine, and then they go their separate ways. All right, that is the case of rape. Now, the Torah in Sefer Shemot has a similar case. Ki yifate ish betula. Here it doesn't say na'ara, it just says that she's a betula, and yifate means seduces. Torah understands that seduction of a young girl is the same as rape, and therefore he has to pay as well. There's no willingness on her part. Her consent is not considered consent. Asher lo orasa, and again, she is not engaged. If she is engaged, that's a whole nother law, because then it rises to the level of eshet ish. V'shachav ima mohad yimharena lo leisha, and so he sleeps with her. Then he has to give her a mohad, meaning a bride price. So this is important that here it calls it a bride price. Ima en yima en avir lititalo kesef yishkol kemor habetulot. If the father refuses to give her to him in marriage, then he has to pay this amount, the amount of mohad betulot. Now you see here it doesn't define what the amount of mohad is. In the case of rape, it says that it's 50 kesef, but 50 kesef. But here it doesn't call it mohad. So this is important that we're going to connect these two together in a Gezerah Shava today to teach us that the regular mohad for any case of a betula is going to be 50 shekel, which ends up being the same as the 200 zuz that we started off the Masechet with. All right, so now we are ready to read the Mishnah. The following na'arot get a kanas if they are raped or seduced. Haba ala mamzeret. Someone who rapes or seduces a mamzeret, a young girl who was born from incest or something, so she's a mamzeret. Now the chidush here is that although the rapist is not permitted to marry the mamzeret, and so he might claim a way to get out of the fine, to say, listen, I'd be willing to marry her and take care of her whole life, and so now I shouldn't have to pay the fine because I'm not marrying her because she doesn't want. I'm not marrying her because I'm not permitted to. So we might think that, and so the Mishnah comes to say, even though he can't marry her, he still has to pay the fine. And that's the same for all the next cases. Val ha-nitina. A natin is a descendant of the Gibeonites, who were a tribe within Eretz Canaan, and they came and they tricked Yehoshua and told them, no, we're from far away, and we want to make a peace treaty. And they converted. But Yehoshua would not have accepted that if he knew that they were members of the land of Canaan and not far away. And so therefore they did convert, and their conversion is valid. But because they did it through trickery, Yehoshua vayitenem, it says he made them to be like a lower status, that they had to draw water and gather wood and not permitted to marry them. Okay, so also that's a second category of someone you're not allowed to marry. Alakutit, a Samaritan woman. Samaritans are descendants of the northern 10 tribes, but they're mixed in with foreigners that came in from elsewhere. However, when they came in, says in chapter 17 of Sefer Melachim that lions came to attack them, and they got scared of the lions, and they said, this must be because we're not worshiping the God of this land correctly. And so they brought back a Kohen, and they converted. As machloket whether that was a valid conversion or if it was only out of fear and an invalid conversion. In any case, they are not Jewish. They were not Jewish, but maybe their conversion is okay. One is not allowed to marry them, no matter what. Okay, so that's the third category. If a man would rape or seduce a kutit woman, he would have to pay this fine. Habala giyoret. Now, that's the first set. Now, second set. Habala giyoret v'ala shibuya v'ala shivcha shenifdu v'shinkairu v'shinishtachereru pechutot mebenot shalosh shanim v'yom echad. Now, a man only has to pay this fine if someone is a betula. The following, we have a reason to be suspicious that they are not a betula, because they were born not Jewish. So someone who was a convert, or she was taken captive. She's Jewish, but she's taken captive. We suspect that she was violated when she was taken captive, and that happened before the rape. Or she was a Canaanite slave, non-Jewish slave, and either of these people, that the shivuya, she was redeemed, or the non-Jew was converted, or the shivcha Canaanite was freed. And all that happened before they were 3 years old and 1 day. Then, even if they were violated or did have relations before they were redeemed or before they were taken captive or before they converted, nevertheless, any act under 3 is not considered an act at all. Betulim grow back. And therefore, all of these are considered betulot, and he would have to pay. If, however, a woman was taken captive after 3 years old or converted after 3 years old, then we assume, unless proof otherwise, as we saw in the previous perek, we assume that they were violent and no longer a betula. And therefore, this rapist would not have to pay for the betulim because he didn't take that away from her. He'd have to pay other things, but not for that. Okay. Haba al achoto, v'al achot aviv, v'al achot imo, v'al achot ishto, v'al eshet achi, v'al eshet achi aviv, v'al anida yesh lahem kenas. Now the following are all included in incest, and so a person is not allowed to marry any of these people. So again, you might think, since he can't marry them, he have to pay kenas. Furthermore, all of these are prohibited in karet. It's not listing here relations that would be isur, that would be chayav mitah, bidei adam. Because if someone is chayav mitah bidei adam, then they're going to get killed in court. And we have a rule that if you deserve 2 punishments, you only get 1, the more severe. So getting death penalty is going to be more severe, and therefore those would get the death penalty. We're not talking about that. Everybody here is karet. Karet is bidei shamayim. So you can get karet and also have to pay a fine. That's the chidush here. So if someone rapes or seduces a girl who happens to also be his sister, father's sister, mother's sister, wife's sister, brother's wife, or father's brother's wife, or a nida, yes, they do. He does have to pay, even though he can't marry her, and even though there is karet. Yesh afapi shehen behi karet and behen mitat betin. But since they don't get killed by the court, we do not apply the principle of kim le bedraba mineh, that we only give them the more severe punishment. They can actually get both punishments, because one is bidei shamayim and one's is bidei adam. All right, that's the Mishnah. Now question: Hane ne'arot pesulot itlehu kenas kesherot la. The Mishnah sounds strange. It says these get kenas, these that are problematic. Because they were, mamzeret and netina. Sounds like these get one. But if it was a kosher girl of good lineage, then they wouldn't. Why not say kosher? Why not start off with the regular case of a kosher girl who is marriageable, who certainly would get the kenas? Hachi ka'amad is what we mean to say. Elo ne'adot pesulot sheyesh lahem kenas. These, what we mean to say is the following girl or young women are unfit and they nevertheless have kenas. Of course, if they're kosher, they have kenas. And that's the first three. Okay, nara'in ketana la mantana. So it sounds here, it says na'ara, which is that 12 to 12 and a half range. They're the ones that will get the kenas, this fine. But if she's under 12, a ketana, sounds from here that this Tana would say, no, that is not paid for a minor. So whose opinion would this follow? It's subject to a machloket. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Meir hi detanya. Ketana mibat yom echad ve'ad shetavi sheteh se'arot yesh la mecher ve'en la kenas. ומי שתביא שתסערות ועד שתתבגר יש לה כנס ואין לה מכר דברי רבי מאיר. So we would follow here Rabbi Meir, who says in this braita, if you have a girl from 1 day old until she develops 2 hairs, we'll assume that's 12. So she can be sold if a father is very poor, down and out. So there's a law, he can sell his daughter as an shifcha ivriya, and she would work for 6 years, and then there's laws about that the boss or son could marry her, otherwise he has to set her free. Okay, so there is the law of selling for ketana, but not fine. Okay, there's one or the other. However, once she has 2 hairs, until she's an adult, and that would be defined as 12 and a half, during that short time period, if she's raped, she gets that fine, but she cannot be sold. So it's one or the other, according to the Rabbi Meir. So the Rabbi Meir would be the author of our Mishnah that says na'ara only and not ketana. Ashaya Rabbi Meir Omer, kol makom sheyesh mecher and kenas, v'ol makom sheyesh kenas and mecher. Only one of these laws can apply, and if you have mecher, there's no kenas. That's when the ketana. And if you have kenas, there's no mecher. That would be the law of a ne'ara. Chachamim omerim ketana mibat 3 shanim v'yom echad ad shetibager yesh la kenas. Chachamim disagree, and they say from 3 years old and 1 day, that whole time all the way until she's 12 and a half, she would be deserving of receiving that fine. So this cannot be the author of the Mishnah. Now we ask, Kanas in mecher la, according to Chachamim, would they say that they get the fine, but cannot be sold? That can't be, because the whole law of selling one's daughter is talking about when she's young. That's that whole time period when she's under 12. So it can't be that it would be exclusive. So rather, according to Chamim, ema af kenas bimkom mecher. They would say that it's possible that both laws apply at the same time. That a father can sell his daughter under 12 as a maidservant, and the law of kenas applies during that whole time period and even afterwards until she is 12 and a half. All right, good. Now, v'hane b'nei kenasaninhu ve'amai ikri kan ve'lo tiyeh le'isha isha re'uya lo. Now, we're going to question the foundation of the law, very first law of the Mishnah. Why should these girls who are not marriageable receive a fine? After all, the pasuk in Devarim says, and she will be to him as a wife. It should only apply to a woman who is fitting to be a wife to him. And then she doesn't want to, so he has to pay this fine. But if she's not fitting to be a wife, then what's the reason? then if not willing to be wife, then he should not have to pay. Amar Resh Lakish na'ara ne'ara ha ne'ara. So if you look, it says the word na'ara 3 times. So Resh Lakish says, so chad legufeh, one is to teach the very basic law that na'ara gets the fine. Another one is to include a woman who you're not allowed to marry because of a lav, like a mamzer. And the other one is to include women that you're not allowed to marry because of chayave karetot. You get karet, and that would be those who are arayot, mentioned in the Mishnah. So that's how Resh Lakish learns that even if they are not eligible to be married, nevertheless he has to pay the fine. That's Resh Lakish. Rapapa amar betula betulot ha-betulot. Actually, if you look in Shemot, it says word betula 3 times. It doesn't say 3 times. It says betula. But it says ha-betulot, but we can parse that down to 3 words, the single betula, the plural betulot, and with ha-yedi'ah, ha-betulot. And so from each of these variations, we learn chad legufeh, v'chad la'tuyeh chayve lavin, v'chad la'tuyeh chayve karetot. One for itself, and one to include chayve lavin, like mamzer, and the other 2 include chayve karetot, like those incest relations that are mentioned in the Mishnah. All right, so we have 2 ways of deriving it. So the question is, why do we need both? How come Papa doesn't agree to learn it from the word na'ara that is found in Sefer Devarim? Because Papa will say, I need the word na'ara to teach me something about Abaye. The Abaye taught, derived from there. Patush natan lavi hana'ara lavi na'ara velo lavi meta. If you have a case where someone rapes this young girl, and before they get to court, she dies. She dies of natural causes, whatever. And so, before the court can give a sentencing, so then he doesn't have to pay, because the pasuk says that he will give to the father of the young girl, and not to the father of someone who's dead. So the Papa says, I need the word na'ara to teach me the law of Abaye. Okay, fine, now let's turn it around. Resh Lakish how come Resh Lakish doesn't learn it from habitulot like Papa does? I will tell you, I says, I need that for a gezerah shava to learn the amount of money. The Tanya kesef yishkol kemohar habetulot, sheze kemohar habetulot, omohar habetulot kazeh. As I mentioned before, it says the words mohar betulot, that this will be the bride price. It says that in Shemot, but it doesn't say how much. So we need habetulot to attach us to the law of in Devarim, where it says it's 50 kesef. And so 50 kesef, now I know what it is. And 50 kesef, I know that is the number, but how do I know that that is the usual amount that a betula should get? Oh, because it says mohar betulot here. So he needs ha betulot to attach these 2 laws together and teach that all betulot, they get 200 zuz, which is 50 shekel kesef. Okay, now Resh Lakish namemi ba'elek. Now Resh Lakish, doesn't he also agree with Abaye and would need na'ara to teach me the law of Abaye, that if she died he doesn't pay? And wouldn't Papa also need the gezerah shava here to teach me that the mohar betulot is 50 kesef? So actually they need each other, so neither of them can use any of these pesukim. But we have to go through all that to understand this answer. Actually, there are 6 verses written all together, meaning 6 words, instances of na'ara, hana'ara, betula, betulot, habetulot, that we can use to derive things from. So today, legufaihu, one of the na'ara and one betula, that we need for the original context of those laws. Chad Abaye, one of the na'ara instances will be to teach the law of Abaye that if she died doesn't pay. Chad gezerah shava, and one of the betula instances will be to teach that the amount of the bride price is 50 shekel. Today, now we have two extra. One of them, one of the Na'ara and one of the Betula. Those are two extra. And you don't have to say them both for both laws, because both of these laws have already been connected, the seduction and the rape. And so one to include Chayve Lavin, and one to include also Chayav Karetot, that even though one is not allowed to marry them, since they don't get Chayav Mita in Betin, so they get that punishment, and they also will have to pay the fine, even though they can't go through with the marriage. Now we're going to note that our Mishnah would disagree with the following two opinions. Our Mishnah said that the man would have to pay a fine, both for an Isur Lav, like a Mamzeret, where if one does Kiddushin with a Mamzeret, the Kiddushin does take effect. They are legally married. They're just not allowed to remain married. And so he would have to pay a fine. Also, for example, the case of sister, where it was an Isur Karet. In that case, if you try to do Kiddushin, the Kiddushin does not even work. And nevertheless, he still has to pay a fine. So the Tanav our Mishnah says he has to pay a fine no matter what, even in both of those cases. But this excludes the following Baraita. The Tanya, Velo tiyeh isha. This is the pasuk that he has to pay the fine in the case of rape. Shimon Batimni Omer Isha sheyesh ba havaya. He would have to pay the rape in any case where Kiddushin does take effect. So that would include Mamzer, but would exclude Arayot. So Shimon Batimni would say, in the case of Arayot, if someone rapes his close relative, a sur karet, he would not have to pay a fine. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya Omer Isha hadeuya lekayama. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya excludes the paying of the fine even more, and he says you only have to pay a fine if the rape is with a woman who he can remain married to. And so that would mean not a sister and not a mamzer. The sister can't be married in the first place. The mamzeret, the marriage works, but he cannot remain married to. So meaning in all the cases of the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, would not have to pay. All right, the rest of the daf is going to explain the difference between these two opinions. Mai benaihu, which case would be one agree with, two would not the other. Amar Rabbi Zera mamzeret unitina ika benaihu. Lamanda amar yesh bahavaya hanamem yesh bahavaya. Case of mamzeret unitina would be a difference. According to the first opinion, Shimon HaTimni, these can marry. Kiddushin does take effect, and so therefore he would have to pay a fine. But according to the Bishimon ben Menasya, who says you only pay a fine if you are allowed to remain married to them, you can't remain married to a mamzeret or netina, and so he would not have to pay a fine for them. Okay, now, Rabbi Akiva, hold on. All that was according to the majority of Tanaim. But Rabbi Akiva, we remember from Masechet Yevamot, had a much more stringent definition of what creates a mamzer. Rabbi Akiva damar en kiddushin tofsin b'chayave lavin. He said that even chayave lavin, like a mamzeret, kiddushin does not work. Mai benaihu. So then, since the kiddushin does not take effect, in that case, then that would be both Tanaim, both Rabbi Shimon's and this Baraita would agree that no fine in that case. So what would be a case that would be different between them? Ika benaihu almana lekohen gadol kerebi simai. If an almana marries a kohen gadol, this would include a regular kohen marrying a divorcee. But we're using this example. Then that is not. It's a sur lav, and so this is less than the chayave lavin. De Tanya. Rabbi Simai Omer min hakol oseh Rabbi Akiva mamzerin chutz ma'almana lekohen gadol she'amra Torah lo yikach ve'lo yechalel chiludin hu oseh ve'en osin mamzerin. Even though both of them are mentioned as a lav, but Rabbi Simai explains that Rabbi Akiva would make a distinction between these two cases. Rabbi Akiva would say any isur lav, like a mamzeret nitina, the kiddushin would not take effect, except for almanah marrying kohen gadol, because there it says lo yikach ve'lo yichalel. He shall not take in marriage, because if he does so, he will profane. That means the marriage does work, because a child that he has will be a halal. But the word does say the word yikach, so it makes a halal, but it does not make a mamzer. Okay, these two things go together. If it makes a mamzer, then the kiddushin doesn't work. If it doesn't make a mamzer, that means the kiddushin does work. Okay, so even according to the Rabbi Akiva, we do still have a case of almana lekohen gadol, where the first opinion would say that produces that marriage does take effect, and you have to pay a fine. And the second Rabbi Shimon says the marriage does not take effect, and you would the marriage does not take effect, and he would not pay. He would say the marriage does take effect, but you can't remain married to her, and so therefore you would not pay a fine. Fine. Ul Rabbi Yeshevav. That is still there's still yet another even more stringent opinion within Rabbi Akiva, which is said by Rabbi Yeshevav. Damar bo v'nisvach al Akiva ben Yosef. He said, let us go and yell at Rabbi Akiva. His name was Akiva ben Yosef. Shaya omer kol she'en lo bi'ab Yisrael havalad mamzer. Because he is going to make a lot of mamzerim by being more stringent and including more prohibited relationships as producing mamzerim. He's causing mamzerim to increase in Israel. And so in his interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, he says any time that one cannot have bi'ah, a Jew cannot have bi'ah, and that would include a kohen to a divorcee or a kohen gadol to a almana, the child is a mamzer. And so now, according to this definition, what is the difference between the two Tanaim? Right? So far, all the cases that we've said before, said so far, not only are prohibited to remain married to, but the marriage will not even take effect. So what would be a case that would be different between the two Rabbi Shimons? My benaihu, Ika benaihu, chayave aseh, mitzri va'adomi. Oh, someone who's prohibited not by a lav, but as a mitzvat aseh. So regarding a mitzri and adomi, it says that one should not marry an adomi or mitzri in the first two generations. But if you look in the language of the Torah, it never says you're not allowed to marry them. It just says banim asher ivaledu lahem doshi yavo lahem bikal Adonai. Rather, it says you may marry them after 3 generations. So from this we derive that, okay, before 3 generations you shouldn't marry them. From 3 and on, then you can. So since it says it as an aseh, so if one does marry someone from the first 2 generations of an Adomi or Misri, they are violating an aseh, but they're not violating a lo ta'aseh. And violation of a misvat aseh is a much lower prohibition than a lav. And so in this case, one cannot remain married to such a person, but the marriage will take effect and will not produce a mamzer, even according to Rabbi Yeshevav's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva. All right, so it looks like now with this the most stringent. But wait, there's yet one more permutation. Rabbi Yeshobeb, we're not sure. Did he say his statement as a standalone statement, or was he responding to the Simai? If he was responding to the Simai, then it makes sense, because the Simai said, no, all lavim are mamzerim, except for Kohen Gadol. And then Rabbi Yeshevav is going to come and add to what he said and says, even Kohen Gadol Almana is also mamzer. So that's sufficient. He's adding something, but that still leaves over the Chayaveh Aseh Misrin Adomi that even Rabbi Yeshobeb would not include in Rabbi Akiva's prohibited category. So then that's fine. This would be a difference between the two opinions. But if Rabbi Yeshua was saying a stand-alone statement, not in response, well then we have to take it as more of a blanket statement. Kol she'en lo bi'ab Yisrael havalad mamzer va'afilu chayaveh aseh my benaihu. If he's saying an absolute statement, standalone, that says any time there's a prohibition for Yisrael for it to have bi'ah, then the child will be a mamzer, and that's going to include even Hayaveh Aseh, because no one is permitted to marry a Misri or Adami in the first 2 generations, even though it's only violating Aseh, so it's less, but still that is included in the standalone statement, and that would mean that everyone would agree that such a marriage does not even take hold and certainly cannot remain. And so it would be the difference according to Rabbi Yeshivav. If he has a standalone statement that's a blanket statement about everything, what case could we find that would be a difference between the two Rabbi Shimon's? And the final answer is Ika benaihu be'ola le kohen gadol. If a kohen gadol rapes as someone who's be'ula, she is not a betula, so he is prohibited from marrying her. That's true, but that prohibition is a lower level. Why? Because number one, it's not a lav, it's an aseh. We're not talking about, before we talk about kohen gadol to almana, that is a lav. But marrying someone who was never married, but she was a be'ula, that just violates the misvat aseh that a kohen gadol has to marry a betula. So it's a misvat aseh, and it's also less stringent than mitzvin adomi because sheno shaveh bakol does not apply across the board to all Jews. It only applies to the kohen gadol. So since it's a misvat aseh and it applies only to one person, so even the Rabbi Yeshivav's standalone statement would say that this is okay because he said kol she'en bi abi Yisrael, and kohen gadol does not represent all of Israel. He's only one person and an aseh. Even Rabbi Yeshivav would say in this case would make a difference that kohen gadol would be prohibited from marrying this be'ula, but if he did marry her, the kiddushin would remain, would take effect, but he wouldn't be able to remain married to her. So that would be a case where, according to the first opinion, he would have to pay a fine because the marriage does take effect. According to the second Rabbi Shimon, he would not have to pay a fine because he's not allowed to remain married to her. All right, that was fun. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.